Hi, it's Jen Taub. Welcome back to Booked Up, a podcast that features you, me, and our favorite authors. This week, my guest is David de Jong. He's the author of a mind-blowing new narrative nonfiction book called Nazi Billionaires, The Dark History of Germany's Wealthiest Dynasties. Before he began researching for this book, David covered banking, finance, and hidden wealth for Bloomberg News. This book puts the lie to the often heard claims by descendants and apologists for the industrialists who collaborated for profit with Hitler. You've heard them too, that these business leaders didn't know what was going on in the concentration camps, that they were merely helping Jewish people by buying their businesses on the cheap, and that they really had not wanted to be members of the Nazi Party, but it was just what everybody had to do, a cost of doing business. Piece by piece, David dismantles these myths, and the truth that he reveals is more horrific than any of us can imagine. The glowing reviews have rolled in. Bradley Hope, author of the fabulous book $1 Billion Whale about the Malaysian Wealth Fund, had this to say, quote, David de Jong's explosive debut of narrative nonfiction is as riveting as it is disturbing. At times, it felt like reading the anti-Schindler's List. Instead of secretly helping the Jews, Germany's most powerful tycoons brutally exploited their suffering for personal profit. The fact that some of Germany's greatest fortunes are deeply intertwined with the ignominies of the Third Reich should be much better known. Plus, if you want to get even fancier, check out Yale law professor Samuel Moyn's blurb. David de Jong's sleuthing has uncovered a remarkable and upsetting web of connections between the signature evil of the 20th century and fabulous riches today. With its finely wrought stories of German individuals and families, including Jews who were expropriated, Nazi Billionaires suggests that even today, amends have not yet been made for the profits that some reaped in an era of horror. Why so much belling? It is well-deserved. How David did this and the toll it took on him is at the top of my mind. I cannot wait to speak with him. So, with no further delays, let's dive in. Hey, David, how are you?
Good. How are you, Jen?
Great. Where are you? It looks like a hotel, no?
No, I'm in New York, actually. I'm not in a hotel. I'm in a very sparsely furnished apartment.
Oh dear, did I insult somebody already?
Oh, yeah. But the person is not here, so you can insult away.
So you have a friend are you in Manhattan or what are the boroughs?
Yes, indeed. Yes, the first.
Awesome. So why are you in New York? I thought you live in Tel Aviv now.
I do. But I am giving a few talks here. I'm going up to Providence on Monday because I'm giving the ethics of capitalism talk at Brown on Tuesday.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Is that who is that through a department or a professor in particular?
Yeah, it's the Watson Center and the Rhodes Center. It's to Professor Mark Blythe, who professor of
Watson,
economics.
as in Watson, like the IBM founder. Or do you know?
No.
Rhodes?
Oh, that's a good question.
Cecil Rhodes.
That's a good question. Yes, on topic. Yeah, I believe. I'm not sure. No, certainly not Cecil Rhodes. That is more Oxford area. We have to go to the other side of the pond for that. But it's a good question whether the Watson Center was. Yeah.
It's always nice to insult the people who fund the institution inviting you to speak at the outset of the talk.
Absolutely. I'll start with that. Yeah.
Yes.
But I forget to thank I always forget to thank everybody anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Oh, you do? Can I give you the secret?
Yeah.
Let me give you the secret of how to thank people. Yeah. The person who introduces you, I always say thanks so much, David, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Brown University and your team here, or something like that. Then you don't have to remember every single name, or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. I have to. Speaking of people, so the first thing I do when I read a book is usually look at the acknowledgments, because it tells me something about whether the person is gracious and also who was close to them. And I was stunned because I didn't think I was going to know any names. I saw this name, Max Abelson, who's I just adore. But he's a Bloomberg guy.
Max? So was I.
Oh, yeah. So Max, back during the financial crisis, right after, it was probably during the Dodd-Frank period, so around early 2010, he reached out to me because I'd written something obscure, Repo 105. You do bank stuff. So, right, like I knew about short-term, I knew about repurchase agreements and that the run on Lehman Brothers was in the short-term wholesale funding market, which is, as you know, what that is, but it has to do with
the repo
funding.
Market.
Yeah, and I'm just people listening to us may not know. So, but anyway, I was writing about that, and so Max reached out to me because he wanted to sort of talk about that. It turns out we had both gone to Yale together, not together at different times, and we are just absolutely loquacious people who talked for I don't know how long about everything. And I've always adored him since then. He does such good work at Bloomberg. But when I saw him there, I'm wondering what's your connection, and I wanted to sort of more about how you know him and how he was a catalyst for this book.
Yeah, sure. So I met him first in, I think it was February 2010, when I was a graduate student at Columbia University, and I was living downtown in the West Village on Jane Street. And he lived around the corner on Greenwich Avenue. And there was a cafe on the corner of Jane Street and Greenwich Avenue. And
what was it called?
I forgot the name, because there would be a rotation of these cafes.
I lived right there, Abingdon Square.
You lived around the corner. Yeah. So, and then one Saturday morning, I was having coffee with a friend, and we were speaking in Dutch, and he asked, "Oh, are you guys speaking Hebrew?" And then we were like, "No, we're speaking Dutch." And then he was like, "Oh, my father is South African." And we got to talking, and he was at the New York Observer at the time, and he was reviewing Hank Paulson's book On the Brink for the Observer.
I didn't know that. He did that? Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so we got to talking, and he said, "Oh, I'm a financial journalist." And I said, "Oh, I'm in graduate school. I'm doing a program in history and international relations, but, I want to be a journalist. I've done all my internships in journalism." And he said, "Oh, cool. Let's stay in touch." And we kind of became friends. And then when he moved over from the Observer to Bloomberg, and they started this new team, which what led me to the book. They started this new team that investigated hidden wealth and family-owned companies and family offices. He introduced me at Bloomberg. He because they were looking for people, and I was I was looking for a job after I graduated in 2011, and he introduced me at Bloomberg, and I got a job there. So he led me as a way to, he introduced me to the team, and that team led me to the articles I wrote for Bloomberg, which led me to the book. And then to bookend it, the epilogue of the book, which plays in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, he was the one to tell me to go to that exhibition in December 2019, to go see that exhibition, where then I find out that the main families I write about in the book are listed as donors, which is, of course, completely unrelated. So he really bookended. So Max, brought me or introduced me to Bloomberg, and he gave me the epilogue of the book, as it were. So
wouldn't it be amazing?
I'm greatly indebted.
Oh, he's lovely. And are you in his apartment now?
No, I'm not.
Okay, because that'd be pretty funny.
His apartment. No,
hi, Max.
His apartment is much better, much better decorated than mine.
Okay. Well, I say hi to him in case he's listening. So I want to talk about the origin then of this book, because you did write about, as you mentioned, kind of hidden wealth and banking and these things in Europe, and these things tie together. But I'm curious the steps that you took to decide that this book that you were going to write, Nazi Billionaires, was going to focus on mainly four families: the Quants, the Flicks, the Von Finks, and how do you pronounce that last name? The Oetkers?
Oetker. And it's Portia Piech.
Oh, Portia Piech.
So it's Portia Piech.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So I came to the search. So when I started at Bloomberg then in fall 2011 at this new team, that covered family-owned companies and family offices. And I was actually hired as one of the North America reporters. But they soon asked me, because I'm Dutch, they asked me if I could cover the German-speaking countries. And I would go to, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I would go to the Germanic bureaus of Bloomberg, and so in Germany and in Switzerland and Austria. And the stories I would always come back with were this mix of the financial and the historical and the business side of things. And what really struck me in my reporting was that companies like BMW and Porsche particularly, but mainly the families that control them today, celebrate their fathers, their grandfathers, their business patriarchs for their business successes, but completely leave out their war crimes or their Nazi affiliations while maintaining global charitable foundations, media prizes, academic chairs, museums, corporate headquarters in the name of these men. And after also they had purported to have been transparent about their past. So I thought this was such a, revisionist, revision of history, such a brazen whitewashing that I ended up, I started writing about for Bloomberg, but then I ended up leaving New York in 2017 and moving to Berlin to research and write a book, which I ended up for 4 years. Now, the 5 families that I focus on, the contemporary criteria to qualify, as it were, to be a Nazi billionaire is that you still have to be relevant in global business today. And so not like the Thyssen's or the Krupps, who have died out as dynasties. So you either, you have to run operationally companies like BMW or Porsche or Audi or Volkswagen, or, invest your billions to massive family offices. And secondly, they still have to have a pretty, the shareholder group has to be between like 2 and 12 people, where the economic power is most concentrated, so that they actually have a say, that they can exert their economic and financial power. And thirdly, they have to have heirs. So there has to be a continuation to a next generation. It can't be that the dynasty stops, that there's a sole heir and the dynasty stops after this lineage. Now, for the historical criteria, the way that the 5 families profited, that these families profited, is that they had to be mass profiteers of the Third Reich. So there was either through, it was through mass arms production, through the expropriation of Jewish-owned businesses, of Jewish-owned assets, of Jewish business families, which was a practice that continued, of course, in German-occupied territories throughout Europe in the Second World War. And lastly, through with the mass exploitation of forced and slave labor. An estimated 12 and 20 million Europeans were deported to be exploited in German factories and mines. So those were the criteria.
So let me just make sure I have that right. So you're breaking down both the word, what you mean by Nazi and what you mean by current billionaires into that way. So let me just make sure I've got this. So in terms of the Nazi past, they had to, 3 things: profited from Third Reich, also appropriated Jewish businesses or Jewish wealth. Through this, Aryanization that you write about. And the third is mass exploitation of labor, either through deportation or exploitation of slave labor or concentration camp labor, or et cetera. And then in terms of how to decide if they're still billionaires, for the billionaire half of this, the first thing is I have to still be relevant today in terms of running these conglomerates, or either that or still have the billions they're investing through family offices. Secondly, you're talking about a concentrated control group of a corporation. You said between 2 and 12 people. And finally, the heirs have to still be around, not just the businesses. And so when you talk about that, this is how you got this particular group of 5.
Yes. And these are also 5, Germany's 5 wealthiest dynasties still today, or Europe's, and some on a global level. Of course, there's enormous amount of hidden wealth in Germany. Many of them who created their wealth after World War II, who are not, were not dynasties, who were just self-made businessmen, where there was not this transference of wealth through many generations. Yeah, they by default, of course, didn't qualify.
Right, which is good for them not to have blood money in that sense.
Yeah. Right.
I'm not saying that there's anything, I'm not saying that we're not giving them a clean bill of health necessarily, but not with regard to the Nazi past. In terms of these names, because I'm, sitting here in America and most of our listeners are here, I'm not, except for the name Portia, the other names aren't overtly, household table names, that maybe some of the businesses are.
Definitely.
Is there, if we talk about, I just want to talk about generally like what field, Quant kind of did everything, but kind of what they did, what the fields they were in, or the industries they were in, one by one, and then kind of any brand names today they might recognize.
Definitely.
And the name of the patriarch too. So can you start with Quant and then go down the list?
Yeah. So the patriarch of the Quant dynasty, his name was Günther Quandt. He controlled during the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich, AFA, which is a major battery company, which is called Varta today, which also produces the batteries in your AirPods, and a major arms manufacturer. Now, he laid the basis for what is today Germany's wealthiest dynasty, of which two of his grandchildren control 47% of the BMW group and are Germany's wealthiest siblings and Europe's wealthiest siblings. The BMW group doesn't only consist of BMW, but it also consists of Mini and Rolls-Royce. The two siblings just received, last 2 weeks ago, an annual dividend over 2022 of 1 billion euros. It's about 1 billion USD. So just to give you a size and scope of how wealthy they are.
Oh, before you leave them, this is kind of fun, just to say, am I right? Because I'm looking, you have this fantastic family tree.
Yeah.
So am I right to, I'm looking at these folks. Oh, are these two people Susan Clatton and Stefan Quandt?
Yes, exactly.
And there's a really quite handsome photograph of him in black tie, and he seems like a charmer until you hear what his attitudes are now. He and his sister are railing against the inheritance tax. Kind of mind blowing.
Yeah. Okay. No, they love they love to do that in Germany, or at least if you're wealthy and they head to inheritance tax, which hasn't been introduced yet in Germany.
What? There's never been an inheritance tax in Germany?
Well, there's no been a wealth tax, but the inheritance tax is pretty. There hasn't been. The inheritance tax is pretty minimal in Germany.
Ours is these
compared to other European countries. Yeah. Oh yeah. Right. Yeah. Wonder how that happened.
Tell me about the Flicks then.
Yeah. So the Flicks are the former controlling shareholders of Daimler-Benz, and their patriarch Friedrich Flick controlled the largest steel, coal, and weapons conglomerate during the Third Reich. He was convicted. He was the only one of my main characters who was convicted at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity, because he was the largest profiteer or largest single profiteer in private business of Aryanizations, of forced and slave labor. He exploited more than 100,000 forced and slave laborers across his conglomerate during World War II. And he was also one of Germany's largest arms producers. But his sentence, after he was sentenced, he was commuted. The American High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, commuted out of political expediency, his sentence and that of many other convicted Nazi war criminals in 1950. And within a decade, Friedrich Flick was back on top as a controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz.
If I recall correctly, his sentence was something like 7 years, but he'd only served 2 by the time the Nuremberg trial happened. Is that right?
He was detained. Exactly. He was convicted 7 years. He was detained in July 45, and he was released in August 1950. So he served a little bit over 5 years.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, but only 2.5 years of his sentence. Yeah. If thirdly, there's the von Fink dynasty, which is an aristocratic dynasty which controls most of Munich's land within central Munich and also the land surrounding it today, which some of the prices land worldwide. But most importantly, the patriarch August von Fink Senior his father was the co-founder of both Allianz and Munich Re, which is two of the largest insurers today and back then. And they also co-founded a private bank called Merck Fink, which is controlled by the Qataris nowadays. And then fourthly, there's the Porsche Piech clan, which controls Porsche and the Volkswagen Group, which is not only Volkswagen, but is also Audi, Bentley, Lamborghini, Seat, Skoda, and other car brands. And then the last dynasty that I cover is the Oetker dynasty, which is mainly known for its baking powder and pudding mixes and frozen pizzas, but it also controls the largest beer brewer in Germany, as well as a line of high-end hotels like Le Bristol in Paris, Lanesborough in London, Cap du Eden Rock on the Côte d'Azur, and a whole other number of high-end hotels.
Given how these families and their businesses are clearly very well known in Europe, I'm wondering if this book was published there, because I'm reading the 2022, just published in the U.S. edition.
Yeah, so the German version came out 2 weeks after. German translation came out 2 weeks after the original version, the English language version, in May 2022, and the reaction in Germany has actually been, sales have been very well, reviews have been very good, and I love talking in Germany because the questions you get are always very nuanced, very informative, also very critical. But the wider German public didn't really know the details of their most powerful business dynasties and their largest political donors, because the German public is so inundated on a daily basis still with revelations regarding the Third Reich on every level of its society, that they have also slightly become desensitized to such revelations.
This is the hardest thing for me in reading the book is what you're describing, is because I'm a Jewish American, and I was born in the late 1960s when the Holocaust was very much still in my parents' and grandparents' minds. My family had come to the States mostly from Eastern Europe, but some from England, early 20th century. So if people, obviously we probably had some cousins who perished, but all we knew is we were watching it from here. And I was given not just the Diary of Anne Frank, but plenty of books about the Holocaust as a young kid. And I feel like I knew a lot about these stories about Goebbels and Hitler and all these folks, and maybe even generally about German industry. But when I read this book, there are things that I didn't know. And it's hard for me to sort of tease out what news you're breaking or ground you're breaking here. But so I went into your the back of the book right after acknowledgments. You have this note on sources, and my mind was blown at the kind of work that you did, and how you found, the reason why you're able to kind of get into the details of what was going on is you actually had private letters that no one else had ever gotten to. So can you talk a bit about, before you tell me, I'm really interested in what the German reactions, we can get to that. But two things. What languages do you read and write? Because obviously German has to be one of them. And secondly, tell me more about the sources in these antiquarian booksellers in Germany.
Sure. So I'm native Dutch. I speak English and write and read in English, obviously. And I read, I read and speak fluent German. But those are the three languages. So, which, I couldn't do the same research for, say, Italy or France, where there's a lot of investigation to be done still on the collaboration of these two countries with their own regimes and the Third Reich as well. Now, I moved from New York to Berlin in October 2017 to conduct the research, and I had an office in Berlin, and I use it as a base, and I have a massive, I ordered a massive amount of secondary source material as a kind of background, but most of the research were conducted in archives across Germany, across Europe, and across North America too, because of course the Allied authorities between 1945 and 1950, when they occupied Western Germany, they are actually, I would say, NARA, the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and in College Park, Maryland, actually have the largest trove when it comes to documents of German conglomerates and German businesses that they all confiscated in that period.
Oh, right, because the Treasury Department was looking at that for purposes.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
Exactly. But then there's a lot of these family archives too, which are open. They're hard to find, but you have to go to the furthest reach in the furthest corner of Berlin, or you have to go to Darmstadt, which is south of Frankfurt, or you have to go to the denazification. You have to go to the state archives in Munich to find a lot of files. So I would say those really were, and a lot of the files also have been digitized. Now, another treasure trove was, as you mentioned, were German antiquarial booksellers, which there's an incredible website, zvab.com. If you ever want to do research on any German subject.
I'm sorry, hold on one second. You said Z, yeah. But you mean the letter Z?
Pardon. zvab.com. Exactly.
Okay, yeah. ZVAB. I know. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And, I could get private letters from Günter Quandt about his travels on a cruise he made in 1938, which were bound, which I could order, which was made in book form, which, shares some of his racist views on the people of the world, and so it gave more of an insight who he was in his private life, because most of these men I tried to, shape, in fleshing out characters, are such one-dimensional people who, want to expand their business empires. They're, for the most part, they're opportunists who thrive in kind of any political system, but, their focus on expanding their business empires and their fortunes at all costs makes them very one-dimensional. So I looked very hard to give them a kind of to delve into their private lives as well.
And this is, I think, why not just the information that you're disclosing, but that you made, because you decided to research and then write in a narrative nonfiction style, you bring people to life. You do make them multidimensional. They have very complicated personal lives, which I found fascinating. It reminds me a lot of my friend Zach Carter, who wrote the book about John Maynard Keynes. I don't know if you've read his book, but so I appreciate books like this. I know how hard it is to do what you do, and I think it's a testament to what you do that it's just sort of, you read it and you think, well, yeah, this seems like it's really happening, and I'm really in the room here with these folks.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's such incredible work. I think the greatest achievement in this book is that you do put a lie to these kinds of claims that we hear from descendants, as well as other apologists for these Nazi industrialists who collaborated collaborated for profit, essentially, with Hitler. And the kinds of things that we often hear are, well, they didn't really know what was going on at the concentration camps, or, they weren't cheating Jewish business owners. They were actually giving them money they needed to escape. Or, that you hear, everybody had to be a member of the Nazi Party, the way you hear that. Today everybody does actually have to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party, or you can't do business, kind of like that kind of thing, right? And in fact, not only are these things that people want to believe to rationalize things, these are the lies people told on the stand. And I am stunned, because you will piece by piece demolish these myths and these outright lies. And you offer proof. Sometimes I check your footnotes going, well, where did this come from? But it's astonishing to me that some of the folks who were, I think, someone who was I don't know if it was at one of the German trials or the Nuremberg trials, but that they just lied on the stand. This is perjury, So thank you for demolishing that. I think that's huge. And I wonder, this is what I'm going to lead you back to what you were saying about general people in Germany, as opposed to the families you approached, which we'll get you to. Was the German reaction kind of like, wow, we've been telling ourselves these stories, or were people still resisting what you're trying to put in front of them, that these folks knew and they collaborated and they profited, and some of them, watched people die in their factories. I mean, and didn't help anyway. So can you tell me what the sort of the reaction was when you say when you've spoken about this in Germany?
I mean, the reaction is, I think the main reaction is that 2 weeks ago, the federal government of Germany announced that they're producing a cheap edition of the book, a €5 edition of the book, and circulating that widely, so that people who were not your typical reading audience gets access to the book. So it has. Wait,
don't they need a copyright license to do that from you?
Yeah, they buy the rights. It's like for
I'm getting worried that they're just stealing it.
Oh no! That would have been that would
be deeply ironic. Okay, I'm sorry to make a joke.
Yes,
okay,
that would be some meta. No. That's fantastic. No. They paid. But I think that is really a testament to what profound effects had in Germany. Is that in addition to the translated version and another limited edition version, there's now going to be a third version, which is going to be spread widely in Germany. And we're talking about the families that are still Germany's largest donors today, like the BMW Quants and the Oetkers. They're the largest annual shareholder donors to the Christian Conservative Party, to Angela Merkel's party, which is, of course, now not in government, right? So had they been, I'm not sure if the federal government would have made a cheap edition of my book and spread it widely. But that has really been the reaction, has been that everybody should know these stories, that the general German audience should know these stories. And to me, I think one of the impetuses for the book was really that I felt that these stories, to the extent they were known, were so contained to Germany, and I really wanted to bring them to a global audience as well. And for example, one of the myths that I feel that I'm dispelling, or the reaction that I get from audience in the US, was that, we liberated the country and then we denazified it, and I think one of the myths I'm really trying to dispel is that denazification never took place in either West or East Germany. There was a continuation in West Germany of money and power from the Third Reich to West Germany, and this vacuum between 1945 and 1950, where the Allied authorities could have done a job of denazifying German society, West German society, properly. They failed to take that they take that opportunity. Instead, what they did was turn over hundreds of thousands of suspected Nazi war criminals and ardent Nazi sympathizers back to West German authorities, who, of course, had no incentive to sentence or judge their fellow compatriots on crimes that they had committed themselves or sympathies that they had held themselves.
I think the hardest part in reading this, and I'm always brought back to William Faulkner's famous phrasing of this: the past is not dead; It's not even past. And I'm going to read a passage and then ask you to elaborate a bit. So, let me
Sure.
just be clear. I promise in our conversation, there are things I'm not going to reveal. Now, I encourage people who read the book not to Google any of the names, but to follow in the story, because there's a lot of interesting and personal tragedies, and I think it's best to read it as you go along. So I'm going to read something that won't do that. But here we go. This is toward the end of the book. And it's about the August von Fink Jr. And the von Fink family, you were just telling us, these are the ones that are very tied to the banking world and to the insurance world. Is that right? Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Here I go.
Exactly.
Okay. And von Fink Jr. was even more secretive than his father. The heir, nicknamed Gustl, never gave an interview to the press. The few images of him showed a tall man with white hair and sharp green eyes, often dressed in a dark gray suit, wearing an hermé tie, and alternating between two facial expressions, a stern look and a smile. He inherited some of his father's oddball thriftness. Although he liked to commute between his stately homes by helicopter, he drove his cars until they rusted through and broke down. Now, this guy, who I think only recently passed away at a very old age, you write a few pages later that he was ultra-conservative, anti-European Union, but mostly a libertarian. And after the 2008 global financial crisis, he decided to enter, not surprisingly, into a gold trading business. But here, my jaw dropped. I'm stunned by what you talk about next, which is he decides to he wants to name this gold trading business. Give it a particular name, so much so that he paid $3 million, the equivalent of $3 million in US dollars, to get the trademark rights. And the word it's an acronym. It's Degussa. And can you tell me why that is a chilling decision? What does Degussa harken back with? And also who this von Fink is for German politics?
Sure. So Degussa was a chemical company, but which originated as a smelting company of gold and silver. And Degussa, during the Third Reich, they already patented in 1922. They developed the gas Zyklon B, together with IG Farben, at that time the largest chemicals and pharmaceuticals company in the world, which of course the SS purchased from them, made a deal with them, and used it to murder more than 1 million Jews in extermination and concentration camps. And what August von Fink Jr. does.
And by the way, you and I, let me just cut you off. You and I know this, but just for those who are younger, in the U.S., we don't have people learning real history anymore. The Zyklon B gas, it was, like an odorless gas. They tell people, you're in the concentration camp, go take a shower. Everyone has to strip down. They go into these large rooms, and instead of turning the showers on, they just, close the door and pour this gas in, the Zyklon B, and people died. That they murdered because this was the final solution. Yeah, was complete mass murder. Okay, and this so the company, the name you're mentioning, Degussa, worked with Farber. I am Farber. Is that the name to make this?
Yes, IG Farben. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and. So what August von Fink Jr. does in 2010 is he buys the naming rights.
Oh, wait, there's more to this. I'm sorry, before we get to this.
Sure.
The part that you said about gold, that this company was also...
Yeah. So what they would do after, Jews were murdered in the gas chambers, they had people who would remove their gold fillings and their silver fillings from the mouths of those that were murdered, and that gold and silver would be smelted, part of it, and also would be smelted in Degussa, in partly in Degussa factories, as well as all their silver and gold and other valuable metals that had been stolen from them, those that had been deported.
And just to be clear, let me just back up, just because today when people have a cavity in their tooth and they go to the dentist, it's filled with some kind of epoxy or whatever, or ceramic. Back in the day, people, if you had a filling, it was filled with gold or silver. So these are millions of people who are murdered. Their corpses are stripped of their fillings. Also before, when they get to the death camps, all their jewelry is taken away. And so this company, Degussa, was in that business. And this guy who supposedly, he wants to hide his Nazi past, but yet he names this gold trading company Degussa.
Yeah, and then exactly, and then uses it on high-end locations all across Europe, and you can find them still today, revives the Degussa name to start a gold trading business. I mean, it is certainly, I agree with you, Jen, it is the most, would say,
it is so
the
dark.
Contemporary examples, the most chilling example. It's beyond comprehension, really.
I mean, it's equivalent of it, because I didn't know, but I guess this has been known. I didn't realize that the Volkswagen Beetle itself, the first Volkswagen car, was created for Adolf Hitler. I guess other people knew that. I didn't realize that. I was shocked. But it'd be the equivalent today, and people, be the equivalent today of them doing a new version of the Beetle, but with like human ashes in the back of the car. Like, what the fuck is? I'm sorry, but how can you name a gold trading company after people who were melting down the fillings of murdered Jews? Why was this person even accepted into civil society? And not only that, right? He was part of one of the parties in Germany. He supported their
alternative
rise.
for Germany. The far right party. Yeah. So, his father, who was, a Nazi ideologue and one of the largest profiteers of Aryanizations and really idealized Hitler. His son, he's the only example in the book of where there's a continuation from father to son of far-right backing today, because in the 1990s, after he sold his private bank, his family bank, Merck Fink, to Barclays initially, he uses the money to parlay it into becoming one of Europe's and the world's largest private investors. And he starts also backing his political views, or starts money to political parties, all on the libertarian fringe in Germany. Again, anti-European Union, anti-Euro currency, anti-immigration. And as he grows older, he moves, and in 2013, the Alternative for Germany is established. And he becomes, suspectedly, because it was never proven, but he suspectedly becomes one of their main backers. And
because you have the same dark money situation that we have here.
Yes,
normally knew. Yeah,
exactly. It's basically through dark money packs, through he's allegedly funnels money to the AFD, and one of the ways that the AFD was funded, because it becomes Germany's largest opposition party in 2017. Thankfully, it was decimated in the German federal elections in 2022. For 5 years, it was Germany's largest opposition party, another far-right party, first time in 75 years that it happened. And he funds them partly, or the AFD is funded by selling Degussa gold in their web shop.
Oh, God, I just don't feel well right now talking to you. I don't usually have this. It's hard. I mean, this is hard. And so I want to talk about personally, you talk a little about your own background. I believe your father's side of the family might be Jewish. I'm wondering.
Yes, that's correct.
Tell me about how your background plays into doing this, and emotionally how you worked through this, how it affected you, this research.
Yeah. I would say that it actually didn't, because I think the story of my families, both from my mother's side and from my father's side, is a story of tens of millions of Europeans. And it was really kind of purely my professional interest and drive which drove me to write the book, to wanting to shine a light on it. But of course, I was very much what I would say is that going into the book, I was very much aware of my grandparents' stories during World War II. I mean, my grandfather, my Jewish grandfather, hid in Amsterdam for 3.5 years in the center of Amsterdam. And, he was helped by 3 generations of women, a mother, a grandmother, a mother, and their daughter, and survived the war. And his wife, he was separated from his wife and my aunt, who was then at the time 3 years old. And they fled. My grandmother was native Swiss, and they fled to Switzerland, but were arrested on the Swiss-German border, on the French-Swiss border by a Gestapo officer who took pity on my grandmother and her 3-year-old daughter, and then said, "Well, flee tonight. Report back tomorrow morning. Implicitly, flee tonight," which is what they did, and they arrived safely in Zurich after an arduous journey over the mountains. But their companion, a famous painter called Max van Dam, he did report back in the next morning, and he was deported via Drancy to Sobibor and was murdered there. So, yeah, and even from my mother's side, my grandfather was an avid sailor who tried to sail with his best friend to England to join the Royal Air Force, and the second attempt, they were blown back ashore, and they were arrested by German soldiers, and they were sentenced as political prisoners to forced labor in the industrial area of Germany, the Ruhr area. And he was basically a slave labor in a steel factory, and he was 6'7", and he came out weighing 110 pounds.
Oh my God.
And he barely survived. He was revived in a sanatorium in Switzerland. So I was very, but that is a story, again, that is a story of tens of millions of Europeans, and it made me very aware of history. And in a sense, it did influence me in that what I would say infuriated me and what gave me the energy to write this book, and back to my emotional state, what kept me going for 40 years was how these, some of the world's wealthiest families are so brazenly whitewashing history today by having foundations with the motto "Inspire Responsible Leadership" in the name of a Nazi war criminal, like BMW does. That kind of, seeing that distortion of history, that really kind of gave me and then knowing my own family's history, kind of gave me the energy also to work on this day in and day out for 4 years.
Before I ask you about some of your contacts with the family, I want to say one thing,
Sure.
which I find you're very good at, as you tried to do, and I mentioned, bringing these people to life, making them multidimensional. And I found that your portrait of Magda Goebbels, formerly Magda Friedlander, was incredible. I mean, she comes across as a sort of bored, very attractive young divorcee looking for meaning and just sort of access to elite circles. And then she's just drawn in, obviously selfish and sadistic, but drawn into this cult of Nazism. And, I see similarities in people in the U.S. in terms of what's happening during the Trump era. And it's frightening. And I wondered, though, there's a point in the book where she's visiting a friend at a sanitarium, an old high school friend. And do you believe there's something that you have a letter that you quote from this friend? I don't know if I believe it, though. I mean, there's this thing where it sounds like according to the friend, she sounds almost remorseful, or seems to say, well, Hitler was a monster, as if she didn't know, but kind of takes ownership. What do you think of the portrayal of her toward the end of her life? Do you think that her friend was just being kind to her memory? Do you think she actually looked back on it and realized she had made mistakes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it was both a combination of of Magda being candid 2 weeks before her famed murder-suicide in a Fuhrer bunker, where she murdered her 6 children by giving them cyanide, and then committed suicide with her husband, the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, and also a way of her friend being kind to her. I mean, how can you be kind to a woman who went down as probably the most infamous Nazi, more infamous, I would arguably than Eva Braun.
I agree.
She wasn't dubbed the first lady of the Third Reich for nothing. So I do think she said something along those lines, but it was also her saying that, giving that information to Magda Goebbels' biographer, was also a way of her giving her some certain sort of repentance, shortly before her death. She's such a fascinating character, of course. A woman who's obsessed with power. I mean, her high school boyfriend is Chaim Arlozorov. I live in Tel Aviv. I live 2 blocks away from Arlozorov Street. He was one of the famous Zionist.
Tell about that, because
fighters.
I hadn't been familiar with him. And it's interesting that his life. Can you remind me a bit about that relationship?
Yeah. I mean, Magda Friedlander, she was called because her stepfather was Jewish at the time, and she took his last name. Her boyfriend was Chaim Arlozorov, who later became one of a very famous Zionist, who was assassinated under mysterious circumstances in July 1933 on a beach in Tel Aviv. The murder has never been solved. And then, of course, Magda then ends up marrying Günter Quandt in his second marriage, and they have one son, Harald.
But the whole crazy thing about this, she's 17 years old when she meets like a 35-year-old guy on a train. I mean, she reminds me of like Evita Peron. Yeah. I mean, she's got her eye on how to advance, right?
Oh, totally. I mean, it's,
Yeah, and so it's nice. I like that you've brought her, but it's just as much as her story with all the families. I feel like I get to know them, especially the Pudding Prince. It's very, what a funny. Okay, so here's what I'm only laughing because this is such a heavy topic, and there's something I love that you wrote here about, let me just read this. My maternal grandfather had a way of taking some gentle revenge on the Germans. He constantly made jokes about them. He was my hero growing up, a proud Dutch patriot. My grandparents lived on a farming estate in a tiny Dutch village with 300 inhabitants near the German-favored beaches. And quoting your grandfather, another incoming invasion, he quipped every spring. He would ask me to promise never to take the Germans seriously because they took themselves so seriously. I earnestly swore to him that I would not. Humor is the best revenge, he said. What a lovely man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I get through stuff.
Yes, he was. Yeah. And I mean, it is. I mean, he's right. I mean, it's so spot on because the Germans, and I'm engaged to a German woman. They do take themselves so incredibly serious. Still to this day, they have this perfect mix of self-loathing and superiority. Which is very combustible.
And I don't want to be offensive to any Germans. Sure. I mean, all of us, right. I mean, I make generalizations about Americans. We can make generals. I know what you're saying, but yes, that is apt.
Sure. Yes.
So let's go back to kind of as we wrap things up. I want to talk about the way you reached out to the families and how some families have tried to be transparent, and then reports came back and they didn't like what the report said. But can you tell me about what that was like with the five families when you how responsive they were?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what they do is a very insidious and subtle, well, not so subtle, cover-up of history, is that they commission historical reports who are only published in academic tomes, in 1,200-page academic tomes in German, who then never reach a wide audience. So then afterwards they can pretend, consumer facing, as if, nothing has happened, and they continue to cover up history. So when I reach out to them with these questions, confronting them about their whitewashing and they're taking ownership or moral responsibility for history, they either declined my interview request, they gave me no comments, or their spokespeople, either of their companies or their family offices, gave such, corporate PR non-answers that, it gives such a jarring contrast between the contents of the book and this appendix in where they all respond. And of all the heirs that I reached out to, only one grandson, the grandson of Friedrich Flick, I corresponded with, and I cite some of the correspondence. Exactly, Muck, Muck Flick, exactly. And he, and I cite him saying, yes, horrible things have come out about my grandfather, but he gave us so much more than wealth alone. Now, exactly what he gave more than that remains unclear, but that was his response. And he was very candid and quite reflective, but he still couldn't distance himself at age, 80 or almost 80 at that point from his grandfather, who he regarded as a genius still.
I want to now circle back as we actually do wrap up to one of the impetuses, a catalyst, another catalyst for the book. There had been a story recently in the news, and I'm forgetting the name of the family, but there was a young heiress
Ryman.
who. Yeah, so tell me about that and how maybe
Bowsen,
she has.
Bowsen, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Bowsen. Yeah.
Either one, though. Actually, you can choose either one because I was shocked. The bagel thing was pretty amusing. So tell us about those, because these give me a little more hope, and I want to end on a note of hope.
Sure. So I start with the story of Verena Bowsen, who was this young, she's now about 29, cookie heiress who in May 2019 gives a speech at a marketing conference in Hamburg where she says, I'm a capitalist and I want to buy a yacht for my dividends, kind of offhand jokingly. And then she gets called out on it on social media, and then Bild, Germany's biggest tabloid, calls her up and says, well, didn't you know that, your family exploited forced and slave laborers in your company? And she says, we treated our forced laborers as well as German employees, and we don't have anything to be ashamed of, which causes this whole a scandal and a moral outrage in Germany and also globally, which kind of starts off the book. Now, I end the book with the story of the Ryman family, who in that same year, in 2019, discover are Germany's new richest family, who control American brands such as 7-Up, Snapple, Panera Bread, Keurig Green Mountain, Pete's Coffee, Einstein Bros Bagels. You can go on and on. And they discover within the span of 6 months that from one side of their family, that their father and grandfather were ardent Nazis, who, wrote letters to Himmler saying we're an Aryan company who exploited forced laborers, but then 6 months later discover, and a big story in the New York Times was done about it, how their grandfather from their father's side was actually a Jewish man who was murdered in the Holocaust. And what they end up doing is they, for lack of a better word, they end up putting their money where their mouth is and renaming their foundation in name of their grandfather who was murdered, and funding it in perpetuity by donating 250 million euros, about $250 million US dollars, every 10 years, adding it to the principal, while still being transparent that their father and grandfather on the other side were ardent Nazis and SS members, served for the Nazi party in the municipality, exploited forced laborers, etc. Of course, this is a exception to the rule. None of Germany's or the world's leading business families, originally German, have these kind of stories where they descend from both victim and perpetrator. So that is, of course, kind of a one-of-a-kind story.
That made that family a bit, the Rymans, a bit unusual. My favorite part about that, because you mentioned the brands that we would recognize, Krispy Kreme, Pete's Coffee, Einstein Brothers Bagels, Keurig and Panera and all this. I love that you reminded us that when it says Krispy Kreme owners admit to family history of Nazi ties, and how the Boston Globe's Jewish American food critic wrote a searing column called and I'm quoting the name, I found out Nazi money is behind my favorite coffee. Should I keep drinking it? And then you said, my personal favorite was a parody piece in McSweeney's. I love McSweeney's, titled, quote, "This is embarrassing, but it turns out our fake Jewish bagel chain was funded by Nazis." When this came down, I remember I went to someone's house and they had some food from one of the places. I don't know if it was Panera or it was there's this other nice place, and I'm forgetting the name of it, where they always have shakshuka and other delicious, I forgot the name of the chain. And I went to someone's house for dinner. I said, "Are you serving us Nazi cake?" So it was pretty funny for a while. But I mean, this is, I do appreciate that they're choosing to reckon with their past and not do.
Yeah, I give them as a kind of, I give them as a kind of positive counterexample to the rest of these families, at least to a modicum of transparency and reckoning with their past. And actually, with such enormous power, particularly given that we consume their products on a daily basis, that, they don't let their dividends flow to a global charitable foundation in the name of a Nazi war criminal while covering up his history, but actually owning up to history and taking more responsibility for history, which German business, by and large, still hasn't done to this day.
So what did I forget to ask you? I mean, is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think we really covered all the bases. I would say so. Yeah, there's nothing that really comes to mind that immediately that we forgot. I think.
How do people find you, or if people want to find you or your book, or know what you're up to these days? How can they do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at David de Jong. And I have a website. You can send me an email, and I will most likely respond. DavidDeJong. No, so I anglicized it. So so it's David, and then instead of DE, I made it the Jong, because David de Jong is such a common name in the Netherlands that I anglicized my handle. I made it David the TheJong.
That's very, very American. So how long before you go? How long will you be in the States, and are you going back to journalism soon?
So I'm actually working as a Middle East correspondent these days for the Dutch Financial Daily, and so I'm covering the Middle East, and I will be going back for Passover. For Passover. So on Wednesday, I fly back to Israel.
Oh, good Pesach, and good luck with everything going on in Israel right now. It's quite the place to be.
Thank you. It is. It's wild. It was Monday. It was a crazy day.
It's encouraging, though, that people, when they reach their limit with authoritarianism, they stand up. But I will be following your reporting from there, David, and really thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Jen.
Oh, that is a very heavy conversation, yet so rewarding. I cannot recommend this book enough. And I'd like to take this moment to thank Jeff Steiger, my husband Michael's dear friend from high school. Thanks to Jeff, I discovered this book shortly after it was published. Jeff is one of those very normal people with a real job who just happens to be a voracious reader, and he has never steered me wrong. So thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with another show as we continue to explore the writing process and the nonfiction world together. Please let me know what you think. Send me an email to bookedup@politicon.com. You can also write to us at P.O. Box 147, Northampton, Massachusetts, 01060. To keep up with the show and our featured authors, follow Booked Up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And please give Booked Up a 5-star review. It really will help other people find us.